Thank you, Doris. If you care to follow the scripture text, I'm going to be reading a few verses out of the 7th chapter of the book of Nehemiah as a way of introducing ourselves to the chapter. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, just a few verses. Let's hear the word. Then it was, when the wall was built, and I had hung the doors, when the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites had been appointed, that I gave the charge of Jerusalem to my brother Hanani and Hananiah, the leader of the citadel, for he was a faithful man, and feared God more than many. And I said to them, do not let the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot, and while they stand guard, let them shut and bar the doors, and appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, one at his watch station and another in front of his own house. Now the city was large and spacious, but the people in it were few, and the houses were not rebuilt. Then my God put it in my heart to gather the nobles and the rulers and the people, that they might be registered by genealogy. And I found a register of the genealogy of those who had come up in the first return, and found written in it, and he lists in the rest of that chapter, just about the whole chapter, the names by families of the people and the numbers that came up in the first return from Babylon. Would you bow with me, please? This morning, God, it is my privilege to attempt to be a spokesman for your kingdom as I stand in your presence. And God, this morning, I do know that unless you speak, nothing happens. So, Father, I ask you in a very special way to take my words, make them now. Rescue me from me, O God. For this I speak in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. I know sailor was walking on a dock, and he ran into a shipmate he hadn't seen in many years. They had much to catch up on, and as they were reminiscing and remembering the good old days, the one said to the other, says, I notice you don't look too well. Says, it looks like you've had some bad luck. He said, yeah. Says, I have. Says, you see this peg leg? Says, well, I was out on the deck one day and my leg got caught in a line and it was mangled so bad that they had to take it off. My, you have had some terrible bad luck then, haven't you? Well, yeah. He says, you see my hand here, this hook? Says, I was on the deck again one day and one of my shipmates fell overboard, and as I reached over to grab him, a shark came up and took my hand off. And that's why I'm wearing this hook. He says, well, I noticed that you have a patch on your eye. He says, yeah. Says, I was out on the deck again another day, and just as I looked up, a seagull flew right over, and you can imagine what happened. Well, is that how you lost your eye? And he says, no, that was the first day I had my hook. Well, I've got to have some fun in life, right? I've got to laugh a little bit. I think God has a sense of humor. Just look at us. There's a word that comes out of the 127th Psalm that I often think about. It goes like this: unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchmen stay awake in vain. And I thought those words fit very well into what's going on in the whole entire chapter of the book of Nehemiah. They just fit like a hand in glove in this story. Once he got the report of how bad things were in Jerusalem from a delegation that had come down to the citadel in Babylon, led by a man named, he calls Hananiah, and he calls him brother. And we are not to understand that as a blood relationship, but that simply he is another Jewish friend, a Jewish acquaintance that he knows. Nothing about bloodlines. And he hears that those individuals who escaped The Babylonian captivity aren't doing too well. The city is in ruins, that marvelous city of David with its majestic walls and majestic gates. The gates are torn down, and the city is just in a terrible state. It's almost a slum area. He knew right then, he says, I began to pray. I prayed for the forgiveness of my fathers, and I prayed for our sin. I began to fast and pray, and I did that for many days. He tells us that over in chapter 1. And then he came to the conclusion that he knew what he had to do, but he also knew that he had to get permission to do it. And so he goes to the king and gets that permission. You see, his want to, ought to, and must do is underwritten here by the hand of God, and he tells us that on more than one occasion. When he goes to the king, he is granted permission. He's granted letters of authority to go back into the territory. He is granted a letter of authority to log timbers out of the king's forest for rebuilding purposes. And he goes on and makes this statement, according to the good hand of my God upon me. That's how I was able to accomplish what I needed to do. Now that same idea carries over into our own personal lives. We can build a life based upon our own personal desires, our own personal goals, our own personal intelligence, our own wherewithal, the resources that we may have. We can go to the best schools in the country. We can get the best education that is available to us. And it can be a good life. But life is much more fulfilling when we have God involved in it. Jesus says, I have come that you might have life, that you might have it more abundantly. But it's not about quantity of life, it's about quality of life. And you don't have to watch very much television to find out that there are a lot of folks out there who have a very poor quality of life. Investigation Discovery is a program that deals with police activity. Now, you might watch that and you might not. I've watched some of it. My wife just seems to love it. She just watch it for hours. I get bored with it after a while. But everywhere these folks go, it doesn't make any difference what part of the country they go in, they run into the same kinds of people with the same kinds of problems. They're just barely eking out a living in life. Many of them are on drugs. They're just in chaos. I was watching one the other day, I think maybe Friday, and there was somebody who had called the police and found two little kids out in the dark, barefooted, walking along the road. And just fortunately, this good Samaritan saw them and called for help. And the police came and took them into custody, kind of for their own safety. Just little kids. I'm not talking about big kids. I'm talking about little kids. Small children. They didn't know what was going on to them. They didn't know what was happening to them. And that plays out over and over and over in our world. How much better life is for everybody involved when God is involved in it. How much better life is for children when their parents are godly parents. All of us here probably were raised in Christian homes. We had mothers and fathers who took us to church. They didn't send us. We had Bible study at night. We had what we call family circle. One of our parents, if one was out, one of them at least read the Bible every night, and we prayed every night before we went to bed. We can build nations. We can build cities and towns and whatever, but the nation that has God as a solid part of its foundation is indeed a blessed nation. That's what the poet of Psalm 33 says. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. I'm so glad that I was born and raised in America. Now, it's not a perfect country. We have problems. You know that. I know that. I'm not telling you anything that we don't know. But this country was based, what do you want to call it, a Christian country, not is immaterial to me. It certainly is based on Judeo-Christian principles. It's all over our documents, our historical documents. It's engraved on many of the buildings in Washington, D.C. You can go there and find them for yourself. The biblical narrative is very clear on this point. When Israel lived up to the covenant relationship that she had with God, she prospered. But when Israel failed to do that, she didn't do so well. The book of Judges is a good example. The story that covers many years, many hundreds of years of Jewish history tells us about that. As chapter 7 opens up, we are informed that the wall has been completed. In chapter 6, verse 15, Nehemiah says he completed it in 52 days. The gates were hung finally at last, and that's the final step. Jerusalem is a secured, quote-unquote, walled city once again. And I've read some articles some time back, a few years ago, and wondered where all of these gates were that hung out in Jerusalem. Golden gates, bronze gates. And the authors of the article came to the conclusion that the gates were basically just wooden frame structures that were covered in gold. So we don't really have the gates because wood rots. And we know what can happen to gold. It can go into somebody else's bank account. It can just disappear. It can go into some government's coffers. I read somewhere that's what happened. There was a need here, says the Bible, for an infrastructure. We ought to talk about that, haven't we? We've allocated a lot of money because our infrastructure is not very good. Our bridges are falling apart. Our roads are falling apart. This is happening. That's happening. We've allocated $1 trillion on one occasion that went somewhere, didn't go to infrastructure. And we hear a lot of talk now about infrastructure. Life needs an infrastructure. You and I are very familiar that when a city, a hamlet, a village opens up more territory, new housing developments, they have to provide infrastructure. There has to be water and sewage. There has to be a fire department. There has to be policemen. There has to be emergency services. There has to be governmental services. We need that infrastructure in our life. And so Nehemiah, recognizing that, develops an infrastructure here. If the city is going to function properly, he sets up an infrastructure because they still need protection. They're not quite that secure. Danger still lurks in the territory. The Persian governors are still on the sidelines waiting for that opportunity to take advantage of the situation so that they can report back to the citadel in Babylon or in Persia that Nehemiah is getting ready to rebel against the empire, and that's the last thing that Artaxerxes wants, is a rebellion. He doesn't need that. He's got enough problems already. But the Persian governors are going to try to foment such a thing. You see, here's the thing about it. The fear is that if Israel once again becomes a power, that it could still be dangerous. It could still rebel against the empire. That's never going to happen again. Israel will never be as powerful as it was in the monarchy, particularly in the time of David. It will be 1,800 years. It will be 18 centuries before Israel ever becomes a power similar to that ever again. And that happened in 1948. Biblical scholarship holds the view that these folks who would be familiar with how to lead a worship service, the singers and the leaders, the Levites, the gatekeepers that were appointed supposedly as gatekeepers, might know how to do a worship service, but were they really qualified to be gatekeepers? Because he appoints gatekeepers. He needs gatekeepers. Somebody to watch. And anybody can be a gatekeeper if you can use your eyes very well and see a danger coming. You can raise an alarm. And so he uses what is available to him. He set 2 men in charge, he says, over the whole city. Kind of like, I don't know, city managers maybe, I don't know. With instructions to shut and bar the gates and keep them that way until sunup. Gatekeepers. Now I thought about that. What about our own life? Don't we need gatekeepers for our own personal life? You know, one of the things that we probably never think about very much until something happens and something begins to bother us, our conscience begins to bother us, and we call our conscience our gatekeeper, the gatekeeper to our soul. We're familiar with the old adage. It says, let your conscience be your guide. Sometimes we ignore our conscience and we go ahead with whatever plans that we've made for ourselves, only to find out later that perhaps we should have listened to our conscience. We might have been better off. Our conscience was probably right. In January of 1997, somewhere around the 8th, 9th, somewhere in that area, a Brinks armored truck turned over on a highway in Florida. And of course, when it did that, money was just flying everywhere. Money and coins were just flying everywhere. Maybe some of you remember that story. As one report put it, the incident held up a mirror to the country of how far down our moral decline had reached. Because as the truck driver and a fellow employee lay bruised and bleeding inside the truck, people were having a great time on the outside of the truck. There was an atmosphere of celebration, joy, glee, and happiness because money was just everywhere. Rush hour traffic was blocked up for miles because motorists stopped to scoop up cash and continue their journey to work. Thousands of crisp dollar bills and loose change rained down on an overpass. And mothers with baby buggies were throwing money into their baby buggies. One little elderly lady filled a box. One young girl on her way to school emptied her book bag and filled it with money. Onlookers and participants had plenty of justification and rationalization for their behavior. Which is more moral, they asked? Because it was an impoverished neighborhood. To return the money and leave our children impoverished, or maybe send them to college and enrich the family for generations. We deserve a little something, don't we? Said one. And then they got God involved in it. The Lord was willing for it to happen here, one man said. There's a lot of poverty. It was a miracle. Police estimated that more than 100 people helped themselves to the money. And middle-class persons on their way to work scooped up thousands of dollars. You see, what they did was borrowed the conscience to their soul, and it could not speak to them. Their conscience was immobilized. Now, I don't know about you, but it's just kind of hard for me to take something that don't belong to me. It's kind of difficult for me to take something that belongs to somebody else and call it mine. And it's just impossible for me to take advantage of somebody else's misfortune. I don't care who they may be or what they may be. Because you see, there are other gatekeepers to our souls. The family unit, for example. What kind of family were you brought up in? What kind of moral values were instilled in you by your parents? The community in which you live, by the school you attended, or the church you may have been involved with. What about the church community? What about the social mores of the community in which we live? What about one's relationship with God? You see, now those are a lot of things I'm not going to take time to unpack for you, because we'd be here way, way too long. And then he finds something in verse 4 and 5, he tells us. He finds a registry. Because most of the rest of that chapter deals with that registry. All these people that came up. Now, basically, everything that is said here is lifted right out of chapter 2 of Ezra. I want to know something about the population of that period of time. What does the scholarship say? How many people lived? It certainly wasn't like it is today. It is estimated here in May of 2018 or something like that, this year somewhere along the line, that there's about 7.6 billion people living on the earth. That's a lot of folks. And some areas are more crowded than others. There are some countries where people have just got 2 square feet of space to live, it seems like. Just packed in little small spaces. Well, there weren't that many people in Nehemiah's time. In verse 4, he tells us that the city was spacious, but the population was small, and the houses were not rebuilt, and that's significant. They focused their time, instead of building houses, on rebuilding the wall. But I want to caution you about being very careful about numbers when they're used in the Bible. Be very, very careful about those. Biblical scholarship argues that there was probably 120 to 150,000 people living in the province of Judah at the time, and that only approximately 1/4 of them were deported to Babylon. That makes around 18,000 people. We think in terms of thousands and thousands, even millions. Now again, let me caution you about numbers here. But here's the one creature, regardless of how many there were. They were the elite people. They were the leaders. They were the artisans. They were the craftsmen. They were the people that could foment a rebellion if they chose to do that. And you want to take those people out of the picture. Because in the first century world, in the time we're talking about, there were just oodles and oodles of poor people. Now we think we have poor people, and we do have poor people in our country and all over the world. But all of these people just eked out of the major portion of just eked out a daily living. They were called Amharites, people of the land. It was those people you'd find Jesus among most of the time. Not down at the palace, hobnobbing with the politicians, but among the poor. And so that seems to be kind of the situation. Nehemiah says he found this registry with these names upon it, who came the first return. Now this registry becomes very important when you understand its significance in Nehemiah's time. Now I went down through there and I listed all those numbers. He tells us that in verse 66 that the total assembly was about 42,360 people. I counted up all of those numbers and I added them up, and I came up with 27,441. So you've got to be careful about biblical numbers. See, but my numbers may not have included women. His 42,000 may have included women. I don't know if the other numbers were just the men. And he uses, I said, as the word assembly here to refer to the whole class of people, the whole group of people, maybe that just escaped exile. I don't know. But we have to accept what Nehemiah tells us, because we don't have any other story. But here's what is really important about this list. Do you really belong to the community? Do you fit in? Do your bloodlines match? Are you really Jewish? Are you really a part of this chosen group of people that have a right to be back in Jerusalem. Verses 63, 64, 65 illustrate the point. The priests were not listed in the registry. And since they couldn't prove their heritage, they were considered defiled by the governor. And by the way, the governor at the time is Nehemiah. Nehemiah was appointed governor of Judah for about 12 years after he rebuilt it by the king of Persia. And so, since they couldn't prove their heritage, they were barred by the governor from eating any of the sacred foods kind of thing, you know, the kind of showbread that might show up in the table. They weren't participating to participate in any of the holy things there. Now, that took me somewhere else. Over in the 22nd chapter of Matthew, Jesus talked about the kingdom of heaven being like a wedding feast. King threw a wedding feast. Went out and invited all these people. Highway, byway, hedges, wherever he could invite people. Nobody came. Or he invited, then he went into the highways and byways. Anyway, he invited all these people. There was one guy that got into that wedding feast. He didn't have on a wedding garment. And he wasn't supposed to be there. So they began to question him. How'd you get in here? We didn't have anything to say. They bound him head and foot, threw him out. And Jesus described it like this, where it was darkness and gnashing of teeth. Now see, that's what hell is like. It's a good picture of hell. Because in hell, you're living outside of the light of God. There is nothing but darkness there. And there are many people right now who are existing in that kind of darkness because they're living outside of the presence of God involved in their life. Now they don't know that. You and I know that. They don't believe that probably. But I know for a fact that if you're living outside of the presence of God in your life, you're living in darkness. And it's just that simple. The Bible is just that clear on it. That's the message of the church to people beyond our doors who don't want anything to do with us. Oh, I believe in God. I believe in God, dude. Sure. I believe in a higher power. Most primitive person in the world believes that there's something, that there is a power beyond them that is higher than they are. They're always, the most primitive people in the world are always reaching for that higher power that is beyond themselves. But believing is not sufficient. Your belief has to force you or compel you. Let me put it this way. Let me rephrase. To compel you to make some kind of positive action. To make an about face. To turn in a direction different from the direction you're going. I've always... I don't like to get into arguments with people about that. But talk to people. Do you believe in God? Sure, I believe in God. What difference does it make in your life? And the point is, they can't answer that question. If somebody says, I believe in God, okay, ask them the next question. What difference does it make in your life that you believe in God? And you'll find most of them cannot give you an answer because they don't have one. It doesn't. It doesn't. Revelation 19. John described the wedding feast of the Lamb, and it's going to be a great celebration. John 3:16 tells us that everybody in the world is invited to it. But Jesus reminds us that many are called, but few are chosen. Being present or absent is a matter of personal choice. I was listening to a preacher on the radio this morning as I was coming to church, and he was talking about atheists. And the man was involved in college level education. I don't know if he was an assistant professor or adjunct professor. Anyway, he made this statement. He says there are more atheists on college campuses in America among the professorship than there are in the general public, as a rule. And he says, I know because I'm involved in that life. Being present or absent is a matter of personal choice. It comes down to acceptance or rejection of the gospel of Jesus Christ. To get into that wedding feast, one has to have on a white robe. To get back into the city in Jerusalem, one had to have the proper bloodlines, or you didn't belong. You weren't allowed to participate. You weren't supposed to be there. To get into the wedding feast of the Lamb on that final time when history comes to a close, you've got to have on that proper garment, which is a white, spotless robe, cleansed of all of its sin by the blood of Jesus Christ. And that's the only ticket in. What counts with God is not about bloodlines. What counts with God is what do you do with Jesus Christ? What do you do with Jesus Christ? Where does He fit into our lives? Where does He fit into our world? The chapter ends up on a very high note. When the 7th month came, the children of Israel were in their cities. Some kind of conclusion. Nehemiah had accomplished what he set out to do, was to rebuild Judah and the cities. Now how far we're to take that, I can't tell you. We only have this verse to describe it. And the 7th month is the month of Tishri on the Jewish calendar. The month of Tishri. That comes in September and October. But be that as it may, he was able to do it because he had the good hand of God upon what he set out to accomplish. Unless the Lord builds the house, unless the Lord builds that life, they labor in vain who attempt to do it. We can get along without God. We can get along without the church. But the Bible tells us that life flourishes when it's lived in connection with God. We're going to stand and sing our hymn, our commitment hymn number 294. Have thine own way, Lord. I thought the title of that song is very appropriate for us, even as Christians. Because if God has His own way in our life, look at what we can accomplish who believe. If God is allowed to have His way in the lives of the general population, look what kind of world we could have. If you need to make some decision today as we stand and sing, I encourage you to do that. Have thine own way, Lord.